world of comics, Mr. Grant Morrison.
Thanks a lot. That's very kind of you. I can't express how much that means to me in words, so I'll do it in the form of dance. To me, it just comes down to a very simple equation, is that life plus significance equals magic.
Grant Morrison is the most popular and the most successful comic book writer of his generation, but he's also the most controversial.
You know, he'd get involved in these adventures that just seemed so absurd and fictional almost.
Art and writing are magical things.
I don't know how much of it, what you hear about him is myth and what's reality.
Everybody wants to hear the crazy stories about him.
And maybe the guy walks around his house and like takes out the garbage in a silver suit, but I sort of doubt it.
I'm not going there. The magic stuff.
When you hang out with Grant, you just get like the fucking download.
I went up to him drunk and in tears and basically told him that he had changed my life.
And he does have the image, the glamour. Projects a certain aura.
Because he's iconic, just visually.
He's always had very strong interests in a lot of weird shit.
When he shook my hand and he has these intense laser eyes and his big voice, I was just like, wow.
It almost feels like he's above all of us, looking down at everything and can see the whole.
We, as three-dimensional entities, were interacting with a two-dimensional plane. And
Grant's the only guy who knows how to draw hypertime on the back of a napkin.
What you have to remember about Grant is that his greatest creation in a lot of ways is himself.
So it's never going to be me, you'll never get it, you know, and you'll never know, and whatever you think I am, that's what I'm not. I grew up as a kid in a fairly poor part of Scotland, in Glasgow. My father had been a soldier in World War II. He'd started as a soldier and then he became a pacifist.
He was a big man, he was a strong man. He had a moustache, looked a bit like Stalin. He was a character. But I'd been up at my grandmother's and one of the last steam trains that ever went on the rails in Scotland came roaring past me. My dad saw me rooted to the ground apparently from the window and ran down, scooped me up. And he said the terror that was on my face and the noise that I was experiencing is why he got really into the whole nuclear war thing, the whole disarmament thing, because he'd seen how frightened I was and the sound, and to him it was the sound of bombs, you know, he'd lived through in the war. He was a political man, he was very political, very driven, do you know what I mean, by the causes. You know, my dad's stuff was all anti-nuclear nightmare brochures, you know, pictures of cities burned out and screaming skeletons and nuclear fallout. Yeah, but I was kind of used as a decoy when my dad would go in and he'd kick balls over fences and we'd climb in and he'd pretend that his son was looking for his ball while he would take photographs of these underground nuclear bases. So I saw some really strange stuff when I was a kid. It was like, you know, like prisoner style things where you'd look down a long tunnel into a hillside and there's little men in carts driving past. Over here to our left, even though we can't really point the camera at it, is RNAS Coolport, which is the home of the Trident missile defence system. This is the place where my dad used to take me when he was doing all his protest stuff. When he actually got into the underground base, right over there, and they had things like, they had everyone's coffin, cardboard coffins piled up on the wall. And it was the idea that when the nuclear war came, all the civil servants would have 4 minutes to rush to these hidden shelters. And from there, they would sharpen their pencils and start the world up again. You know, it was insane, the idea that they even believed this could happen. But they actually had stacks of coffins, cardboard coffins that could be folded out, and they had everyone's names printed on them from the electoral register. So they were just waiting for us all to die.
So you can see influences of that in things like The Invisibles, the breaking into bases, the underground tunnels, sort of representing the subconscious. And that was my early life.
He grew up during the height of the Cold War, and his parents were activists, and so the specter of the bomb was something that loomed large over his life and his creative career.
My father was getting arrested often for having these demonstrations of breaking into places. So we would have like the Men in Black turn up at the door, and they turned up one night and said to my dad that if they kept it up he would vanish and never be seen again. And as if to prove it, one of his friends was vanished and was never seen again. The guy got in a taxi one night and no one ever saw him ever again. I just lived daily with the fact that my parents were fighting against the bomb. The minute this thing happened, we would be obliterated forever. And for me, the big thing was discovering superhero comics, because suddenly in superhero comics, here were people who could stop the bomb. You know, Superman could take an atom bomb hit on the chest and just smile and shake it off. So all that's in Flex Mentality. You know, the character's talking about the moment where he realised that the bomb, before it was a bomb, the bomb was an idea. And suddenly that understanding of, okay, Superman's an even better idea, so why don't we make that one real instead of that one?
He was here at the convention a couple years ago, and somebody said, so All-Star Superman 10, does that mean that Superman is God? I said, yeah, Superman loves you. Doesn't that make you feel good? He's a more proactive God.
The first superhero comic I remember reading, I was 3 years old, and it was Marvel Man and Baron Munchausen. And it seems very obvious that that was the first one you would read. It's a superhero and a guy who tells lies, you know, so it's almost like the archetype of the writer is Baron Munchausen meeting a superhero.
Grant's mother encouraged the whole comic thing, and I think she was always into the whole science fiction-y type thing and everything.
You know, it was my mother took me out when I was 8 years old. Not only did she take me to see 2001: A Space Odyssey 3 times, she took me to astronomy classes. Then she took me out one night in the cold, pointed at the star Sirius and said, son, that's where we come from. With no explanation. And just left me to deal with that.
Apparently his uncle was a big reader, loved counterculture type stuff, you know, was a 60s guy, was a Crowley aficionado. So when Grant was growing up, I guess his uncle's library was a place that he found, you know, quite fascinating.
Apart from the spectre of the bomb, everything was fun. Kids used to go out a lot then, so we had our own kids' society that had nothing to do with the adult world, that we weren't told what to do. We made up our own games, we played our own stories. I was always encouraged to read and write and draw and express myself, so there was never any problem. I wasn't one of those guys whose parents threw out his comic books or banned him from reading comics. I was really encouraged to live in fantasy worlds.
In the 1990s, Grant Morrison worked with Frank Quetley to create a series called Flex Mentallo. Flex Mentallo drew upon Morrison's own childhood experiences and combined it with the superhero archetypes.
Flex Mentallo was just this brilliant, complicated idea that he had about story and fact and fiction and how the two are kind of the same thing.
All of the stuff in Flex Mentallo is kind of real. When I had my appendix taken out, I was lying in hospital watching this green light all night, just imagining that it was some kind of alien intelligence studying me as I lay on my bed of sick. The same thing when you see the kids sitting in his parents are playing guitars and singing.
Well, they always reckoned Flex Mentallo was based on Grant's father, Walter.
All that's real, you know, like wanking off to drawing supergirls in the nude, you know, as I would do when I was a young teenager that was, you know, without a girlfriend, so you draw superheroes, like getting off with each other and stuff.
After childhood, I got to 12 years old, my parents split up, and that kind of fucked with my head a little bit. And at the same time, I made the horrible mistake of I got a scholarship to go to a boys' school, and I thought this was a great idea when I was 12, and then when I was 14 I was going crazy. I was climbing the walls because I wanted to meet girls, and there was just no way of meeting girls. So what happened to me after this kind of interesting, happy, peppy childhood was that I had the worst teenage years. When I finally got out of the boys' school, I was like fucking 19, you know, and I hadn't even been near a girl. And I thought I was just never going to be alive and never do anything, and I'd be stuck in this room for the rest of my life. And at that time, I really got into comics. I became a proper geek because I had nothing else in my life. So just for years and years of teenage wasteland, you know, I was sitting reading comics and drawing comics and making up stories as a way to escape.
You'd be excused for thinking that the characters featured here had been dreamed up by a top comic strip writer and had been drawn by a professional cartoonist. But they are, in fact, the brainchild and the work of a local 16-year-old artist. They're part of the hobby that has grown into a whole way of life for Grant Morrison of Corker Hill. As he'd been keen on drawing since an early age, he began sketching some of his favorite characters and found he had a talent for it. Soon he progressed to creating his own characters and gave them names like Monad and Luck of the Long. Now, with the help of two young friends, he produces complete stories in comic form featuring his own heroes. Grant says of his own artwork, "I create superheroes because I think people want to read about superheroes just now." Grant has no set formula for his comic strip stories. "I think up a basic plot and make up the story as I go along," he explained. He says, "I'm hoping to take up art as a career. If that doesn't come off, I've nothing else in mind." A lad with a great future is Grant Morrison.
I wanted to go to art school, and that was like my big thing. I thought, at least if I get to art school, I'll meet people, I'll hang out and I'll have fun, and they just didn't let me into art school. And I got the rejection letter through, and just, that was like the end of the world for me back then. I just thought I was never getting out of the house, I was just going to be stuck in there forever.
He didn't drink and take drugs or anything like that. That came later.
I was just drawing comics and making up stories, doing nothing else. I didn't go out at night, I didn't do anything. That gave me a kind of a sympathy for geeks, because I was like a super geek, you know, and so I can understand how people feel when they're in that position, and how things like comics and fantasy can get you out of that and give you something to aspire to, something to live up to. I really felt that they'd saved my life in a lot of ways, which is why I love them so much and why I keep going back to them and kind of trying to make sure those worlds are kept alive and kept vital.
If I had superpowers, the last thing I would do is go out and get a suit. Whereas for Grant, that's the first thing. He would have a huge cape and the collar and everything.
So I had a whole bunch of material, and I went to a comic convention in Glasgow, and there was sort of a bunch of hippies were trying to put together this magazine, Near Myths.
Grant Morrison's first published work was in 1978 in Near Myths, which was an anthology.